Well, thank you very much, also for the introduction, but particularly for inviting me here again. I was actually here 2 years ago, and I'm sure this is going to be a really enriching conference. We haven't had much time to explain what the UNESCO Chair in Adult Literacy and Learning is about, but I'm just going to flag our latest newsletter, and it's actually a partnership with KU School of Education, and Mahesh Parajuli, Professor Mahesh Parajuli is the coordinator in Nepal of our UNESCO Chair. We have also partners in Ethiopia, and Turuak Wakine here is the coordinator from Ethiopia, and also in the Philippines we have Gina Longtok, who's attending on behalf of UNESCO Chair. So that's a quick advert before I begin, so do ask us more. Well, I don't know if I've interpreted my brief too literally, but I decided to reflect on the title of this conference. Because for me, I wasn't quite sure if I understood what context, responsive wisdom and knowledge was. So I'm going to today take you through some of my own reflections about what this title and idea might really mean for us at this conference, with the idea that you will take forward some of these ideas when you're sitting in the sessions, as I just have now, with such diverse presentations, to reflect on what do we really mean by context, responsive wisdom and knowledge in these particular sessions that we're attending. And I hope that I'll be able to provide some conceptual tools for you that you can apply both to your own presentations, but also to the presentations you're listening to and to the sectors within which you work. And I'm going to start off by exploring some of the conceptual debates which inform my understanding of context, responsive wisdom and knowledge, but then look at how we might apply these in my particular area, which is now higher education. As you may have just heard, I did spend a lot of time working in Nepal over the years, particularly in women's literacy, so some of the examples will be coming from there too. So just to give you the background, and this is very much influenced by my thinking over the summer at the BASE conference, which is British Association for International Comparative Education. So I'm drawing quite a bit about notions of comparative wisdom, I suppose you might call it, comparative education and ideas within that field. But also I've particularly been reading and reflecting on what we call the new literacy studies and the work of Brian Street, who sadly passed away last year. He was my PhD supervisor, and I realised that a lot of his work was actually developing a broader notion of context, which really led to this beyond the immediately observable. So I'm going to share some of those ideas as well. And I think both of these stances that I'm introducing and fields of debate really, have methodological implications for us as researchers in terms of how do we actually conduct research, write up texts in a context-responsive way. And I was really pleased that this morning's keynote speeches, which are very difficult to follow by the way, did actually touch on some of the areas that I'm going to be talking about. Emilia's in terms of knowledge production from north and south and the kind of imbalances. And also Balchandra referring, I think, to strategic essentialism in relation to culture, and I'm going to be very much looking at that. And the assumption that indigenous knowledge is always good or right, and is kind of solidified in some way, I think was tackled by both of our speakers this morning. So, to start with comparative education, and issues of context, I thought we could start with this quotation from 1900 from Sadler, who is often considered to be the father of comparative education in the UK. For those of you not familiar with the term comparative education, it was very much originally the idea of comparing your own context, in this case it was the UK, with other cultural contexts and educational systems, And this warning from Sadler, it is really interesting to see it came from so long ago. He's saying, well, you can't wander around among the educational systems of the world like a child strolling through a garden and pick off one flower from another and then worship some leaves from another and then plant it when you get home and think that you'll have a flourishing plant. I mean, it's a really good warning to people today too, because in my country, the UK, they certainly do go off to Singapore or China and it's right, they've got the magic bullet for how we should be teaching maths. We'll just take it back to England, stick it in our schools. And I think the second one comes from Michael Crossley's work, again, on comparative education. And he's drawing attention to the fact that mainstream education is increasingly adopting cross-disciplinary frameworks. And he is saying there are real dangers in the uncritical transfer of policy and practice. And you'll see at last the word context is coming up. He's saying renewed recognition of the fact that context in its multiple dimensions matters. So what I'm wanting to bring out here really is that context is absolutely crucial within this debates around comparative education and has been for many years. Because there's been this push towards comparing very different educational systems. And being context responsive is not just about looking into our systems and the context where we happen to be, but it's also about looking out. And I think this is a really important dynamism that we're talking about, which was touched on this morning in our keynote speakers' presentations, that comparative education too is saying, look, we can take examples from other countries, but it's about, as Lawrence Stenhouse talked about in the 70s, saying experience of other cultures should help to tutor our judgment. So we're not just unproblematically transplanting ideas. Sorry, gone the wrong way. So to turn now to what's been called the new literacy studies, and I don't know how many people here are from literacy research, so I'll give a little bit of introduction to where we're coming from here. There has been quite a challenge to what's been called the autonomous model of literacy. And Street's work, particularly in the 1980s onwards, was suggesting that literacy, as he says, has come to be associated with crude and ethnocentric stereotypes of other cultures. And his whole work, Brian Street, was against this divide between oral and literate societies, between literate and illiterate people, and the idea that illiterates fundamentally lack qualities that literate people have. In other words, it does link to this whole notion of comparative education and judging people by literate norms. And he saw this as a very simplistic theory that led to generalizations about literacy and is based on stereotypes. And his second quotation here is really saying that what reading and writing, the practices and concepts of writing and reading, what they are for a given society, depends upon the context, that they're already embedded in an ideology, can't be isolated or seen as neutral or just technical. And he's saying here that the skills and concepts that accompany literacy acquisition are not coming from automatic way from the qualities of literacy, they're the aspects of a specific ideology. And he's really saying, well, what we call literacy is often, the way that we're taught literacy and the cultural practices associated with that and engaging in reading and writing. So I think this sort of challenge, probably when you read about the stereotypes of illiterate people and so on, we can see it today in Nepal. I've worked in the literacy sector since the 1980s, and I don't think this ideology has changed that much. But I think what this is about not having context-responsive wisdom. It's about a deficit approach to focusing on what people do not have rather than what they do have. And in this case, it's literacy, rather than looking at experiences and resources that people bring. Brian Street's work was very much an attack on what he called UNESCO essay-type literacy. This was in the 1980s, which is one kind of literacy, which is what we often call school literacies. So what's been quite influential in this area of literacy studies, in terms of the tools that we might use, is the notion of a literacy event. And this was coming out very much from Shirley Bryce Heath's work in the States, actually. And this is a quote from Brian Street, which is really explaining what we mean by a literacy event. It's a particular situation where you can see things happening that are reading and writing, and you begin to draw out the characteristics. Now, the photo here on the right, anyone got any ideas what might be going on? Sorry, it's a little bit dark in this context. Hands up. Yes?
Adult literacy. One is adult literature.
Adult, sorry, I can't hear you.
Adult literacy.
Yeah, in Nepal, you think it's adult literacy? What a class, you think, do you? Yeah. Any other suggestions?
Mom is studying with daughter.
Yeah, no, it isn't a mum and daughter, yes, and it isn't class. That gives you a hint. Anyone else? No? Sorry? Child? No. In fact, it is actually a women's group meeting. This was taken during my PhD research in Aragat, and the women who were writing their names in the register, they had to sign when they came to a meeting, because this was a program run by Save the Children US. And the lady here is actually their adult literacy teacher, but this isn't a class. This is a women's group where they do save some credit. So what you're saying to me is what's kind of immediately noticeable as context. I suppose we could think, oh, it's a class. But this is a literacy event. It's a literacy event, not because it's in a classroom, but because they're doing reading and writing, and we can see that the event is around reading and writing in some ways, but you can't really see the context particularly. And so this is what Brian Street was saying was actually a problem about a literacy event, because there's only so much we can talk about the actual event. We have to think about the ideologies, conventions underlying the event that make it meaningful, both for the people in the picture and ourselves. And in this particular case, I was conducting ethnography in Aragat, and I began to understand that there were quite competing discourses around this particular literacy event of signing a women's register, keeping accounts for, say, the children of their funding, and so on, and when they had loans. Neither of the two people here, Sansara and Chinimai, they couldn't read and write very well at all. They only went to a literacy class because they were compelled to in order to get the loan. But they all knew the accounts of their savings group. So if we were thinking about context as beyond this event, I would say you have to start looking at development discourses around what does it mean to be accountable and ways of doing development, I suppose. And in this particular case, a lot of what was going on here was that these women were having to learn to keep accounts, to keep records, to keep meeting notes as well, in the way that we do in formal institutions in the university, for example. So it was a sort of bureaucratic literacy practice which they were engaging with. So what I'm talking about here is really about the context beyond the observable. We can't really see it. And this quote here, I think, sums up quite nicely that the concept of literacy practices has become really important within this field, because it's linking the events and patterns around literacy to something of a cultural and social kind. And Brian Street says, well, you can't understand these models just by sitting on a wall with a video and watching what's happening. There's an ethnographic issue. We have to start talking to people, listening to them, and linking their immediate experience out to other things that they do as well. So I think the difference between a literacy event and a literacy practice approach is really what we mean by context. And that we're talking here about the wider parameters of context. It's not the context that you can just sort of see. Incidentally, I was trying to find some photos for these very dense theoretical slides. This is actually an anthropologist called Stephen Tyler, who's taking field notes in India. If you can see them. He's got a chap behind him in the dark, gazing at him, one of his informants. But I think that sums up quite a bit about literacy practices in anthropology at this time. So just to kind of bring together some of these ideas around context, Brian Street was coming out of a critique of linguists as having a very limited perspective on context, that they were just really seeing it as social context, social interaction. And he's saying here in this first quote, within anthropology, when we talk about context, we're considering the study of kinship organisation, conceptual systems, political structures, economic processes, and so on, rather than just talking about network or interaction. So he's saying there's no point in just making sense of an utterance in terms of its immediate context of utterance. And this, I think, is important within this conference and what we're talking about here. The other kind of quotes I was bringing out are very much around a dynamic notion of context, and I think that's come out this morning too when we're talking about indigenous. What do we really mean with an indigenous context? They're changing all the time. People have mobile phones. It's very dangerous to assume that context is just there and static, in the way that Malinowski did in kind of early anthropology, the context of situation and functionalist approaches. So I think what's happening here is that social inequality, transformation and power are very much becoming the sort of starting points of how we look at context. So it's not about sort of fitting into a social context. And if we're talking about indigenous knowledge, as Amelia was talking this morning, it's not that indigenous knowledge is all good or all right, or we just simply adopt it. It's about engaging with different kinds of knowledges, and not just about preserving a context or languages or indigenous beliefs. And here I wanted to just briefly mention about culture and context, because the two tend to be connected. And I think, well, shall I explain the photo? Turuak. This is actually, I thought this photo sort of summed up what we're talking about with culture here. We're not talking about Ethiopian and English and Nepali and English. We're talking about cultural interaction within situations like this, where Turuak is the university researcher, dare I call you, interviewing, these are women in the highlands, are they, of Ethiopia. So we can immediately see what we were talking about with literacy, that it's not just about introducing literacy, it's about interacting with people from different cultures. And when we talk about literate and illiterate, often illiterate people are more aware of the culture that's coming with the people or the kind of new forms of communication, rather than the actual literacy as such. So this is really what's summed up here, actually, that it's not the mere technical aspects of reading and writing. And I think some of these questions are interesting to reflect on, that there's issues around power, about one particular set of ideas and values being imposed or taken on by another group, and the power relations between them. So the key idea here really is that people aren't passive, they're not sitting there waiting for you to come along with literacy. They engage with these kind of practices, decide what they want to take on and what they don't. And of course the huge dropout rates that we have in Nepal from literacy programs are often because people decide they don't want to engage with that kind of literacy or that kind of literacy practice. So I think it's, in a way, the context is much more than culture, because it's involving ideology, and so being context responsive, if we're talking about culture in this way, is about being explicit about where culture comes in. We're going to go next. So I was going to move now to what you might call context responsive wisdom in higher education, and to take some of these theoretical ideas into the context where I've worked. And I'll say at the beginning that I'm going to draw on some research findings from interviews with academics, both in the UK, also in Nepal, which I conducted a year or two back, and I'm aware that some of them are sitting here, but due to ethics I won't be telling you who, and also in Ethiopia. So I was interested in applying these thoughts I've had around what is context responsive wisdom to higher education, and in what sense are our ways of constructing and communicating knowledge through and in academic research institutions? How can they be seen to be context responsive in the broader sense? And I'm going to take two particular areas of higher education practice. One is research ethics, and we've heard a bit about ethics today, actually in the side sessions that I've been to, which have been really interesting, and academic writing. And because I'm talking about context in the broader sense, I'm not talking about Kathmandu University in a narrow sense. We've got to think about how we're engaging with north-south hierarchies of knowledge production, which is what Olivia was talking about this morning. So, to start with research ethics, I put here, what is the context? And the first quote here is from a PhD student in Nepal, who said, well, I've written for a journal in the USA, and there was a reviewer who asked about ethics. He wanted to know if I took consent when entering the research process and how. And what she was really saying, or the reviewer was saying probably, was that, you know, have you got the same research ethics processes that we have in the UK and the US, and if not, you should be following them, which I think is very similar to the comparative education slide that I started with. Do you completely transplant processes from the north, from UK, US universities into Kathmandu University, or are there other ways, different ways of doing ethics here? And the second quote is actually from one of my students at UEA, from Tanzania, who said, well, the difference between the UK and where I'm coming from, for rural people, if you give people a paper to sign, i.e. the consent form, they think it's taxation or land matters. And then sometimes they may not know how to read and write. And then they'll say, well, why do I need to sign this while I'm giving you my information for eyes in a lot of areas of the world, also in the UK, actually. I mean, I work in different kinds of contexts, not just in schools where they're more familiar with consent forms, and I think exactly the same kind of issues arise. And there has been quite a critique of this kind of uncritical cultural transfer, you might call it, of research ethics procedures from northern universities to universities in the south. But you can see by the first quote from our student here that it's precipitated by the whole thing of knowledge production, and knowledge has to be produced in the same way as it would be by a UK scholar in the UK university. So we're getting this homogenization of what we think is an ethical way to practice. Obviously, this is a much more formalized approach, and if you think about the context, in the broader context of research ethics in my university, UEA, it's because of fear of being sued. It's based on legalistic procedures, and we are actually sued. So I've become very careful about what I do now, in how I advise my students who are going out to different countries too. But that's what's informing our particular research ethics kind of procedures. But I think it's also, as I put here, this quote from Richard Pring, is really about what do we consider to be the context of ethics, the ethics within what context. And those previous quotes were very much talking about ethics in the fieldwork context. We tend to think about that, our ethics committees do particularly, but actually we need to think of ethics in terms of dissemination and the broader construction of knowledge, where it's going, who's taking it up, who's reading it. And this quote from Pring was really, and it was back in 2003, is drawing attention to how the context will affect the amount of harm that might be considered tolerable. In certain contexts, secrecy might be equated with deceit, and the context affects the degree to which the piece of research should be seen as part of a wider, more significant programme of research. And I think this links with, I can't remember whose point it was this morning, there was something about what's knowledge for, and what's PhD for, and so on. And I think it's, for me, about what do we mean by useful research. And we tend to think it's that which is immediately applicable, and we can put it into policy. And that's the sort of research which perhaps is easier to weigh up ethically in terms of our ethics procedures. But I was quite interested in some work by Carrie Pector, who was talking about 3 categories of useful, 2 of which were immediate utility in schools and policy, But the third one she saw as furthering education knowledge and looking about, and that one relates to how the globalised knowledge economy and how it's actually going to be used and taken up and by whom. And of course, in these days of our blogs and disseminating on the internet, we have no clue who the audiences may be. So what I'm suggesting here is when you think about this broader notion of context, with ethics, you're going to have to include what kind of knowledge is constructed and disseminated. And in a way, we, certainly a lot of my PhD students, sorry, some of them are sitting here, tend to think about the fieldwork situation more because they do an ethics clearance before the fieldwork situation, perhaps not so much about the ethics of dissemination and writing up. So that takes me on to the other area I'm going to look at, which is academic writing. And again, this is drawn from interviews with researchers in Nepal. And what I was asking them about really was about the whole notion of interacting with international journals. I mean, over lunch I was hearing how much academics here are valuing publishing in an international journal, and we all know that that has become a marker for quality to publish in an international journal. And so this brings the whole idea of writing for a global audience rather than for a Nepal-specific audience, which really affects how you write, as these researchers were saying. First one, that the ideology and interest of the editorial team is sometimes different from ours. Nepal priorities and German priorities are different. The second one is really talking about the notion of context and saying, well, I agreed with most of their comments, but I had arguments with them too. They didn't understand my context and asked me to write more on the Nepali context. This was very common in these interviews, that people were sort of complaining that they had to give so much about Nepal in order to submit to a journal, which inevitably means you cut out a lot of the kind of rich stuff that you might have put in for a Nepali audience, that in their view was deeper really. And saying, being Nepali, I take things for granted, but they didn't understand Nepali schools. And that reminds me of the photo. Anybody here have a guess of what is this a photo of? Any occasion? Hands up. Anyone? It's in the far west of Nepal. Sorry? Actually here. So I'll have to, sorry, as I've got the power of the microphone, I'll tell you the answer. It's Education Day, actually, in Uchakot district, which is where Professor Mahesh Parajuli did his PhD research, so it seemed appropriate. But I think a non-Nepali audience would have to be informed about what is Education Day, what does this involve, why have they got a big canopy, why have they got all the dignitaries standing up there and the whole school sitting down below. It's not something that's familiar to me in UK schools. So this is an example where you would have to give a lot of context. And the third quote here is, again, saying, you know, my supervisors always say, you know, how can a global audience understand this? And this is a student at KU. If I use a word from Jumla and they ask, what's the meaning for the global audience? And he says, well, I haven't written for the global audience, a Nepali audience, and I'd have to construct 4 pages to explain the local construct, but my supervisor expects this. So there's all sorts of issues coming out here, even at the thesis level, about who you're writing for. And if you're going to convert this into articles, then yes, they may be for global audiences, but the thesis itself may also be read by global audiences. So I think what comes out for me here around context is that you're having to write for another audience who's not familiar with the immediate context of research, and it means mediating concepts and giving additional information. And so I was kind of pondering on the idea of what is context-responsive academic literacy, given this bigger context of global kind of relations around knowledge production, the geopolitics of academic publishing. What does it mean to write in this context? And this first quote is, again, from a PhD student in Nepal who says, well, 99.9% of my reading's in English. The first thing is that you don't get publications in Nepali except newspapers. And I think there are a few Nepali journals actually now, so certainly in TU they publish an issue in Nepali. But all universities publish in English, most schools use English medium. In 50 years' time, no one will speak Nepali. I thought if I lament on the loss of language, I'll be alone. So now I'll celebrate the changing pattern. And sometimes I become more critical and think, let's preserve our language, or I try and flow with the same current. So the language issue is really central within higher education. I don't need to tell you here, I give my lecture in English, and we've heard all of the seminar presentations and discussion in English, because it's accepted that English is the language of higher education, certainly in KU. I was interested, the session I just attended was around Nepali English actually, and we had a bit of discussion about diversity in terms of different Englishes and the notion of world Englishes. So, you know, it's an important thing about how do you engage with changing English as well as changing language hierarchies. And can you actually promote Nepali publications and interaction within conferences like this without kind of marginalising yourself from international educational relationships or interactions. So it's about situating yourself as a researcher in global relationships around power and knowledge, and then this begins to influence the local context too. And I think this quote from a journal editor in Ethiopia, actually in Turat University, Bahir Dar University, which publishes, again in English, a journal of education. An editor was saying, well, using foreign reviewers is problematic because they don't understand the Ethiopian context and need a lot of explanation. And then the article may not be suitable for an Ethiopian readership. So this editor had decided not to go for foreign reviewers because he found it a pain if people then, in their own in-house university journal, had to write as if they were writing for a US-UK audience. So there are decisions to be taken by journal editors in universities about how do you respond to these questions of context. Do you privilege one set of values and priorities over another? Or how can you challenge these kind of hierarchies of knowledges and literacies, academic literacies in this case? So I'll just end here with some questions that seem to be coming to me out of this whole conference theme, and I'd like to thank the conference committee for coming up with this notion of context-responsive wisdom, which I thought these questions might help us to reflect in the various sessions throughout the conference. The first one about how can we position ourselves in relation to the broader context of knowledge construction and dissemination. I think this is really a notion of the researcher as a facilitator of change, and we're talking about transformation not just in ourselves but in institutions. So I don't think it's just about how do we respond, but how do our institutions respond as well. How do we mediate these different practices I've been talking about, ethics, academic writing, in this higher education context. The second one, I've said, how can we begin to transform unequal power relations around educational research? And I think we're not just talking here about the researcher-researched relationship, which is obviously talked about a lot in educational research in schools and so on, but also the wider geopolitical relationships in academic publishing and writing. And it might involve challenging established truths, like whether international, discourse of the international is actually equivalent to quality. What do we really mean by this when we say international journal, I want to publish, or I want to go to an international conference? We need to start looking more critically at some of these notions in higher education. And the third one is, how do we respond to indigenous ways of knowing and learning in terms of teaching, learning and curricula? And I think in education, as educators, we're obviously already challenging uncritical cultural transfer or imposition of pedagogical approaches and curricula. But how do we respond to might go beyond this to thinking about certain indigenous knowledges that is not just, as I said, about preserving these indigenous knowledges and practices and languages. And I remember an interesting discussion with the Language Commission head here a year ago that was about how do we preserve the languages in Nepal, which are spoken by only about 16 people. That has become a kind of priority and an interest, certainly at that time. But it's more about interrogating and interacting with different knowledges. So that's my journey, and I'm hoping that you might be able to apply some of these ideas and concepts to your own during this conference.
Okay, gentlemen, the floor is open for questions. We'll take 2 questions.
Yes, that's an interesting question, and I think I brought in that in relation to culture, because I think what I really learned through my PhD, which was a year living in a village near Ararat, actually, as an ethnographer, was that I had a very essentialized notion of culture, which is quite surprising because I had been married into a Nepali family for several years by then. But I did tend to polarize Nepali, British. I'm in also a Brahmin family, I'm Pant, so I am a Nepali Baju. I know about these cultural practices, but what I learned in my PhD year was that culture is, it's much more around the cultural encounter, and we are constructing culture through our interactions, and we can't in any one context say what is Nepali or English. And even more interesting, in that particular village, I lived in a family, an Iwari family actually, with 17 members. Now there's only the mother there. And the mobility since then, that was in the 90s, is just phenomenal in Nepal. I know some of them in London, they become nurses, the girls. And now what I call Nepal in England, I don't know. You know, it's not about culture, it's about the country where you're living. But and for me, the exciting part of my PhD, and you never get a chance again, you don't get a year to do your fieldwork, do you, as an academic, is that in moving between imic and etic as kind of insider, outsider, not just in terms of how you position yourself, but your understanding and kind of getting into those different contexts. Thank you.